And I want to read to you some of the words. Some of the words that Jeremiah said. And this is hard to read. To sit down and read through Jeremiah is hard because this keeps coming. There's a lot of this grief. There's a lot of this wailing. This is Jeremiah 4. My sorrow, starting at verse 19. I writhe in pain, oh the walls of my heart is beating wildly. I can't keep silent, for I can hear the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. Disaster overtakes disaster. The whole land is laid waste. Suddenly, my tents are destroyed, my curtains in a moment. How long must I see the standard and hear the sound of the trumpet? These are the invading armies that are coming in. For my people are foolish, they don't know me, they're stupid children, they have no understanding. They're skilled in doing evil, but they don't know how to do good. These people that are numb. I look on the earth, and lo, it was waste and void. And to the heavens they had no light. I looked to the mountains, and lo, they were quaking. And the hills moved to and fro. I looked, and lo, there was no one at all, and the birds of the air had fled. I looked, and lo, the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins, before the Lord, before his fierce anger. So there's this passionate man who looks, and this is what's happening all around him. What he does is he says it, and it's really uncomfortable for someone to actually articulate that. It's uncomfortable to read that out, because you don't normally express your emotions like that. But this is a prophetic calling. When you live in a land that has become numb, and a land that has just given up, and a land that has surrendered, to actually articulate that grief is going to make you a little bit of an outcast. It's going to make you feel really socially awkward in a lot of situations, but when you articulate that grief, it enables people to hear it. It enables people to reconnect it. It calls them into an ability to experience those emotions and wake up to it, to experience reality again. And we don't have to face up to that alone. So I want to share a few things about how we can go through the process of opening up to those feelings again. Because the most important thing to know is we don't have to stand in this chaotic and painful world and experience it all by ourselves. Because God grieves more than we do. Because Christ came to earth and lived out that passionate grief here, and because there's a community of people all around us who can experience it with us. And those are the things that we need in place to have a relationship with God, to know Christ, to be connected to a body which enable us to become that prophetic people. And some of you would remember the line from later in Jeremiah, which became famous to us because it was then encapsulated in the Christmas story, where Jeremiah in 31:15, he looks at the people all around him and he says, I heard a voice lamenting and weeping. It was Rachel, one of the matriarchs of Israel, one of the people from whom they'd all descended. Rachel is weeping for her children. And then later on in Jesus' time, when Jesus is born, Herod destroys the infants, and that verse is repeated again in Matthew chapter 2, verse 18. God is like a mother, and God is weeping over these people who are being oppressed, these people who are being massacred, as though it were her own children who had died. That's the sort of grief that God is experiencing when God looks down at earth. You know, sometimes we have a really easy theology that wants to say, God doesn't have any negative feelings at all, right, about this planet. God is love, so we have to understand that everything God feels towards our planet is just love. Well, I want to say there's a lot more complexity to the way God looks at this planet. And one of the ways that God experiences this planet is this incredible heart-wrenching grief of a mother who is watching her children die. Scene from Iron Lady, I don't know if any of you have gone and seen it. I'm not a big Margaret Thatcher buff myself, but I wanted to experience a little bit about what her life was like and what that was like. And there was this moment where she'd gone into the Balkans War, and a lot of soldiers had died, and she sat down and she wrote this letter to the parents of everyone who had lost a child. And it's this crazy moment in the movie where it's swapping from between, she's standing with the generals and she's moving the ships around on the map, and then she's sitting writing this letter. And she says, I'm the first Prime Minister who has served in time of war in Britain who is also a mother, and therefore I can understand that grief. And there's a passion that's nagging at someone who's trying to be tough and step up and be a strong leader, and all of those things help you to keep it together, but then in moments that passion comes to you and you can't avoid it because you are a mother. And you can imagine what it would be like if your child was ripped away from you, and you think, this little battle that happened, this tiny little, doesn't really feature very strongly in the history of the 20th century, because there were a lot bigger wars than that way. But that grief that you feel when you know children have been killed, and you experience that, that is what God is feeling when there is oppression in the world. So we have the heart of God that is weeping for our world, and then we have the cross, which, it's funny, it's come up a lot this week when I've been talking to people about how do we understand what happened with the cross. And Jay was saying last night as well that the cross is God coming to say, look, this is a little bit more of what God is like, which is loving, which is drawing people in, but which is also dying on the cross. And we read a lot about what the Bible says the cross did, but there's also these stories in the Bible, chapters and chapters at the end of each gospel that just describe the cross and describe the suffering. And if you read through the Gospel of Mark, there's this refrain that happens time and time again where Jesus says, the Son of Man must suffer. And then the disciples freak out, they talk him out of it, and then there's a parable, and then you move on to the next chapter. The Son of Man must suffer, and they freak out again, and they have a great big conversation, and they get there, and then a third time Jesus says, the Son of Man is going to Jerusalem, and on the third day he's going to rise again, but he must suffer. And it's like this reality that keeps nagging at you as you read through the Gospel of Mark. The Son of Man must suffer. Why must the Son of Man suffer? I can understand why he's going to say, look, I'm going to go into Jerusalem. There's a high probability that I'm going to suffer there. You don't have to be a genius or understand a lot about the Roman Empire to know that if someone like Jesus goes into the local capital of the Roman army, there may be some suffering involved. But when he says must, that changes the meaning of the whole thing. The purpose of God coming to earth is to stand here on the earth with us and suffer with us, just so that we can catch a glimpse of the suffering that God experiences when God looks at things on earth, like crucifixion, like killing people in the name of holding together a state and an army and somebody's power. So it says in the book of Colossians 1:15 that Christ is the image of the invisible God. If you want to understand what God is all about, you look at Jesus. And what is Jesus doing? Jesus is suffering. So I say from that, God suffers when God looks at the world. It says in Philippians, this is a line that means so much to me. Paul is in jail and he says, I long to know him. And when he describes what it means to know him, he says, the fellowship of his suffering. I'm desperate to understand that suffering that God experiences for the world. As though Paul is not suffering enough in a Roman jail, he's desperate to know more of it. He wants to know that suffering because he wants to be awake to what's happening in the world all around him. He wants to know it because it's the heart of God. And Jesus stood in the midst of Jerusalem in this numb people who were covered over by the Roman Empire and were fairly affluent because they're city dwellers, and life was just going along. He goes into that city and he walks into the temple and he looks around at everything that's going on. And he doesn't just say a couple of Beatitudes and bless people. He weeps. He expresses rage and anger and wrath, which is something we can never talk about God experiencing, because God knows those feelings for the world. And I think that if God looked at the world and didn't feel wrath, didn't feel pain, didn't feel anguish, didn't feel grief, then it would make God a cold-hearted monster that I do not want to know about. God looks at our world and God grieves. So Jesus stands in the midst of that numb city as a passionate person like Jeremiah, and he weeps and he laments over the city. But we, the church, how do people recognize us? They think about Ned Flanders, right? They think about this cheerful person who lives next door, this kind of Charlie Church. Really nice person who, every time something negative happens, kind of chuckles away and says something that rhymes awkwardly, and prays and says grace. And we're so plastic in this world. We're so mindlessly positive about everything. We're so cheerful. We have a Bible verse to make every situation go away. We say, God bless you. Like in the book of James, go and be well fed, God bless you and your homelessness and your grief. And God bless you in your experience of losing your family. Let's just pray. We chuckle away all of this grief. We shrug it off as though we're really easy with it, as though we're really mature people. And what we're actually doing is we're just numbing ourselves up, So then you go and you get another coffee and you put on your headphones and you listen to some Glee soundtrack, which I like to do. It's all good. So I want to say that the passion of God, which exists in God's heart, which exists in Jesus Christ, if it exists in our community as well, then we can be a prophetic witness to the passion of God, and we can be a passionate people. And when we faced up to those things, when we've looked at the reality of our world, then comes the reward. Then comes the understanding of a purpose in life. Because when you see that pain and when you see that anguish, the only thing you can do is begin to think about ways to make it better, ways to get involved and help. And that's when you discover what it is that God has called you to do. That's the process through which Isaiah and Jeremiah went, that we can go through as well. How do we deal with the reality of Waterloo and Redfern that Russell was talking about? Well, it's kind of good if you live in Sydney, because there are lots of ways around Redfern. If you go down Parramatta Road, you go kind of through Camperdown and Newtown, you kind of get into the city, you just go around it like that. So that makes it easier. And if you're coming from the east, we can drive a long way around Redfern. Not many people like to go through it. There's this awkward moment if you're catching the train in from Penrith, it always stops at Redfern, and everyone kind of just freezes up a little bit and looks at the floor. And just avoid that suburb, right? Especially because we've got a nice car to drive past City. A nice car. We've got a nice car to drive past Redfern. I have to get my own back, come on. So in Redfern, that story that Russell was saying yesterday about the man who lost his face and then the person just didn't care about that. That's hard. That's one person. Indigenous people who live in Redfern, not everyone. Indigenous people who live in Redfern have a life expectancy of 50 years. That's a reality we have to face up to. We have to face up to the fact that if you compare the amount of Indigenous people in our population to the amount of Indigenous people who are in prison in Australia, the number is higher than 1,000%.
Yeah.
And if you look at the rates of death in custody, nobody dies in custody except for Aboriginal people. Almost all of the deaths in custody are Indigenous people. We don't have to look very far from home. We don't have to look to the third world. We don't have to look to China to find experiences that we really want to numb ourselves to. When you think about what that means, that a whole racial group living not too far from where I live have a 30 or 40 year reduced life expectancy just because of something about the way that our society and their skin colour interact with each other, then you need a cup of coffee and some soothing music when you hear that. I also live a short train trip from Villawood Detention Centre. We have some people who are involved in our church who are called Walter and Clary, who come every now and then, who are refugees from Bangladesh, where they fled because they're gay people and because they have been beaten to the point of almost dying, and they fled to our country. And you can go to Villawood Centre and, there are so many different political views about the right way to deal with these people who live there, but if you go there and meet them, I've not spent as much time as I would like to say that I have spent there, but I've spent a little time out at Villawood just talking to people and hearing their stories and just thinking, it makes no sense that you're in this place and I'm free. Whatever you think the solution to that situation is. So what do? We can go and run a barbecue and we can meet some of these people. And what does that mean? Having an extra sausage and an extra cup of coffee may not make the hugest difference in these people's lives. But when you do it, something switches on inside you. And what we get out of doing something like that is just so much greater than what we give. Because these things we're holding down, they're actually stopping us from knowing the reality of who we are and the reality of the world that we live in. And when we experience it, we feel a person's pain, then what's happening is we are getting to know the heart of God. And that is a treasure that is just incomparable with the price of running a barbecue. You can go to Villawood and just sit in there and just meet anyone who wants to come up to talk to you. You can spend some time with maybe Walter and Clary, get to know their story. Just find a way to know that. But in a sense, I think we talk about these big issues of Africa and these towns, Redfern and places like Villawood. And that's a little bit easy. If you do that once a month or if you do that once a year or whatever, you can do that. That's a little bit easy. I think that the hardest part about facing up to our numbness is the day-by-day stuff. Is the fact that when we meet a friend, someone who we love, who gets really sick, there's a little bit of a hardening that goes on inside of us because we're like, I have to steel myself to all the things I have to achieve today, and this person is sick. So maybe I'm going to pray for you, but I'm not going to open my heart and really feel the grief of what you're going through. Or we have a partner who may be unsatisfied with their job, all sorts of different things might be going on, and we just say, yeah, they're so grumpy. We find ways of just dismissing these things. What is that grumpiness about? In our interpersonal relationships that we face up to every day, opening our heart to feel the difficult part of that passion, and then all of a sudden the passion can rise within us about ways to improve people's lives when we open it up. But we find these ways to brush it off. The bitch in the office, right? Oh man, she is so nasty, so grumpy every morning. And have you ever sat down and talked to that person? Like, do you know where that is coming from? The homeless person that I walk past, makes the street look so untidy. My strategy in dealing with homeless people on a day-by-day basis, because they're everywhere around the city where I walk, is I avoid eye contact. I don't want to see that, I don't have to look at it. And that's just autopilot for me. I just go through life like that because you'd be exhausted, right, if you actually faced up to that need and you looked at it and you reminded yourself that what you're looking at is a human being, when it's so easy to dismiss that person as a piece of trash. So I want to say that there are a few ways that we can work towards confronting affluence and familiarity and oppression in our world. And just to close this, what I'm saying today, these are ways that we can begin to work towards it, not easy solutions, but we can replace that familiarity that we have for God with a sense of awe. And I believe with all my heart it needs to start in this place of what happens when we're either, it's nighttime and it's dark and I'm faced with reality, or I'm sitting down to read my Bible, or I'm in the shower and I'm in the presence of God. Whether I make that into a nice, pleasant thing that's meant to give me a kind of a morning pep talk and a pick-me-up, or whether I come before God and I'm open about my sin, I'm open about my failing, I'm open about my brokenness. I actually say to God, this is the reality of who I am. And then I listen to what it is that God has to say. It's not always the same thing that is written into Every Day with Jesus daily devotion. Sometimes God has something else to say. And we come before God with genuine worship. That is, not just going through the rituals of church, going through this is my nice company experience, but we come into a place like this, or we come into our quiet place of prayer, and we acknowledge the fact that there is someone before us who is greater than I am. That's the meaning of worship. That breaks apart the religion of familiarity that is the basis of all these different things. And then we replace our economics of affluence with an economics of sharing. And that can look like a lot of different things. But it can mean going up to that office bitch and saying, would you like to have a coffee with me? Really simple sharing. Like we do this in bigger ways. We do the we do the barbecue, and we do the mission donation, and we do the World Vision check. There's your plug. We do those big things, but in ways that sharing actually opens you up to experience another person, breaks aside that affluence because you're aware of that person's need. And the reason the affluence exists is to pretend those needs don't exist. And finally, We replace the politics of oppression with a politics of power. And that can mean a lot of different things. It can be activist, it can be personal. It can be giving a friend a hand, it can be writing someone a letter, it can be all sorts of different things. But in ways that we step out to empower and liberate other people, we challenge that politics of oppression. We give people back their voice. We give people back their ability to act on their own behalf, their agency. We do those three things together, then we become the prophetic community that God was calling Isaiah to be, that God was calling Jeremiah to be, and that we are in this world. Jeremiah standing in the midst of numb Jerusalem, Jesus standing in that temple and bearing witness to the passionate reality of who God is. And we can do that if we're teaching, if we're organisers, if we read and we write, if we're people who heal, whether emotionally or mentally or physically, or just in our interactions with one another, people who speak out, people who volunteer their time and effort, people who comfort others, people who document things, people who do administrative work, people who take photographs and show them to people. All these different ways we can act out this awe for God, which manifests itself in sharing with others and powerful political actions that happen. We find our purpose, we become passionate people. And that's my dream for our community. What Metropolitan Community Church, what Freedom to Be, what Gay Christian Network, what Peace Tree Community, all these different things can be in Australia, is that prophetic voice. And that's something that I'm so deeply passionate about. This one, pray. Holy God, we come before you, and as a confession of sin, we acknowledge the fact that we have so often opened ourselves up just to the numbness, and we're not all personally responsible for that. We live in a world that wants to trick us into that seduces us with comforting things, and enjoyable things, and easy things. But we come before you just acknowledging our inability to help ourselves, our inability to climb out of that, because we're so numb that we can't imagine anything else. And we just ask you to pierce that numbness, to break it, to help us to face up to something harder about the reality that we live in, something more difficult about the experience of our friends and our loved ones, our neighbours, our communities, our nation, and our world. Just ask you that your Spirit would fill this room, that we, your people, would know you. We would have that image of God before us, and we would understand the fellowship of your suffering. We come before you, and we are so thankful for what you are doing in this community and in our lives. Amen.